Hi guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Samuel the Aviator, and today I will be showing you my top 5 planes for flight training. So stick around and let's get right into it. Alright guys, so I know this video is a little different from what I normally do. However, my plane is currently in the shop getting a new alternator and some other work done on it. So unfortunately I'm not able to shoot any videos with it, although I'm really excited to be doing that in the future. I thought I'd quick do this list of my top 5 planes for flight training as something I can do that I don't need to be in my plane to film it. And maybe you guys will really like this type of content and you'll drop me a like and a comment and let me know. And if that happens, I'll be happy to do more videos like it. So without further ado, let's get into the first plane. So my first plane on this list is the Piper PA-28, and that's going to be mainly the Cherokee, Archer, Warrior, anything in the PA-28 lineup, but mainly the flight training planes that you're going to see or possibly want to buy are going to be the PA-28 140, 150, 160, and 180. And you might occasionally see a 235, although I don't believe they do much training in them, although you may want to buy one of those and do your training in it as well as own it as your personal plane. So that's a good option as well. So starting off just with some basic specs, the Piper Cherokee is a fixed gear, low wing, 4-seat plane, although the 140 and 160s I believe are more of like a 2+2. They're a little tighter than the later Cherokees and like the 235 and things like that. They were introduced in 1960, and the early models, the 140 and the 160, I believe, had the Lycoming 0320 engine. The Piper Cherokee 180 had the 0360, and the 235 had the Lycoming 0540, which was actually derated to 235 horsepower. Normally that engine has 250 horsepower, and the fuel-injected versions have like 300 horsepower. So the Cherokee 140s will cruise about 100 to 105 knots. The useful load on those is generally in the 800 pound range, and they'll burn probably around 8 gallons an hour. They're more of a flight training and cheap time builder than they are a cross-country machine, and you probably are not going to want to put 4 people in and fuel and fly somewhere. They just don't really have the power or the room to do that. If you step up to like the Cherokee 180, those will cruise about 115 knots, maybe 120 if you get lucky. They'll burn about 10 gallons an hour doing so, and their useful load is generally around 1,000 pounds. It's a great 4-seater. You can carry 4 people, and mostly full tanks, maybe in the 30 to 40 gallon range. The Cherokee 180 has 50-gallon tanks, as well as the Cherokee 140 and 160. Moving up to the Cherokee 235, the Cherokee 235 should cruise around 140 knots. That will burn about 12 or 13 gallons an hour. Doing so, that has 84-gallon tanks on it, and it's basically the same as the other Cherokees, although it has a bigger engine. Some of the later models, I know they renamed it. I think they renamed it the Dakota as they were moving towards actual names for their planes instead of just numbers. It had a pretty big cabin. It was a great 4-seater. The useful load on those can be anywhere from 1,150 to like 1,300 pounds. Really good useful load. The range on all of these planes is pretty decent. I think the worst range is the Cherokee 140. That's going to be about 150 miles. And in the 180s, 235s, that's going to be up to about 800 miles. So starting at what these cost to buy, the Cherokee 140 is going to cost about $30,000 to buy used. It's going to vary quite a bit, obviously, between the interiors and the paint and the avionics and the engines, as will all of these. The best is just to look on Trade-A-Plane and check them out, see what they're going for at the time you're watching this video. Moving up to the Cherokee 180s, those are going to cost around $40,000 to $60,000. The 235s are going to cost $60,000 to $90,000. And if you buy a Dakota, that's probably going to go up to like $150,000, although the Dakota is not necessarily a flight training plane. Um, they're fairly cheap to own and maintain. Lycoming engines in all of these, they're very reliable. Not really too much of an issue on those. There's not a bunch of ADs for the plane. I'm not going to go through the different ones for the different models because it's all going to be different. I would just look at your specific plane you want to buy and what ADs and airworthy service bulletins are subject to your plane. But the cost to maintain is fairly cheap. The annuals are pretty cheap. Insurance is going to be fairly cheap. Low power, low horsepower, fixed gear, popular trainer. So insurance should be cheap on those. As far as the exterior design, it's nothing special, although the slightly newer ones, I believe starting in 1968, had the third rear window, and they look fairly decent if you paint them up, but they're not an SR-22 or anything like that, but they're decent. The interior on these is pretty well laid out, especially in the 68 models plus. Starting with that, they had the actual yoke style instead of like the butterfly yokes. The instrument panel was the traditional 6-pack. Interior room in like the Cherokee 180s and 235s, like I mentioned, is real good. And they're all around decent plane for cheap. They're cheap to fly, cheap to buy, cheap to maintain. Great time builder, good $100 hamburger getter. They're all around pretty decent plane. And flying, they're very nice to fly. What I fly is a Cherokee 180. There's really no bad tendencies on the planes. The stalls are really amazing. It doesn't feel like you've stalled at all, honestly. They're easy to land, easy to take off. They're really one of the easiest flying planes made. Alright, next up is classic Cessna 172, and I actually got my pilot's license in a Cessna 172, so that's what I flew. They're all around flight clubs, so you might have one at your flight club if that's what you're going to be training in, or maybe you want to buy a plane to train in and then to build time or whatever. Cessna 172 is a classic option. Now these came out in 1956, I believe, and they were made out of a tail dragger Cessna produced or based after that. I believe it was just the Cessna 120 or 140, but they gave it a substantial redesign. Now I'm not really going to cover the real early Cessna 172s. Those were the straight tail models. They were powered by a Continental 0300. They had 145 horsepower, and they're getting kind of old for today's training environment. So what I'm going to cover is like the newer, later 60s, 70s, 80s models, the Cessna 172s we have today. So the Cessna 172s that are your common trainers are going to be anywhere from like the 70s all the way up to brand new glass cockpit models, but this is more based on the older ones like the 70s and 80s, as I mentioned. Those are going to probably have the Lycoming 0320 engine. Those have about 160 horsepower. They'll cruise at about 115 knots if you really push it, and they'll burn about 10 gallons an hour doing that. Their useful load is about 800 to 900 pounds. It's not a true four-seater plane. I would say it's a three-person plane at the most. The plane I trained in actually had a useful load of 721 pounds, I believe. So that was really low. Although you can get a 172 with like 900 pounds, so you maybe could get 4 small guys in and half tanks or slightly more. And that maybe is a 4-person, although it doesn't have great power for 4 people and full tanks, and obviously the useful load's not good enough for that anyway. The range on that is about 700 miles if you get the 54-gallon extended tanks. The normal tanks on these are 43 gallons, and that's 41 and a half gallons usable. They'll cost you anywhere from $40,000 for a slightly older model to about $100,000 for a nicely equipped later 70s or 80s model. Some of the issues with the 172 was the Lycoming 0320 H2AD engine. For some reason, that engine did not lubricate well, especially on cold startups. The valve train did not lubricate properly, so it trashed the valves and the crankshaft and the camshafts and everything like that. That engine was kind of a nightmare for the plane. There are 80s out to fix that engine, and a lot of people upgraded the engine in the 172s to a different model of the Lycoming 0320. Some of the H2AD engines are still around, but most of those have been upgraded or fixed with the proper ADs. So that's not really an issue anymore, but keep an eye out for that. And other than that, these planes are fairly reliable. They're safe. They have great safety rating. I believe one of the best for general aviation. No real issues with that. They're cheap to maintain. I mean, they're a dime a dozen. Everyone knows how to work on them. There's no huge maintenance costs. Annuals are cheap. Insurance should be cheap. They're a fixed gear plane, so no issues there. Now these planes are high wing as compared to a Cherokee, which is a low wing, and I'm not really going to get into that debate at all. You can watch some videos on that, although I find I don't like a high wing quite as much, mainly because of I can't really see the runway or my turn or my points if I'm doing turn around a point or something like that, because the high wing obstructs your view when you're turning, especially steeply. So that's the only thing on that. The newer 172s look fairly decent as far as the exterior. They're not going to win any beauty pageants either. They're decent, especially the newer ones with nicer paint, but where these planes really shine is the interior. Now it's kind of a shame you really can't get 4 people in and fuel legally, because the interior on these planes are roomy. They're roomier than a Cherokee is, unless you go with like a Dakota or something. But the cabin, if you look at pictures and whatever, the sidewall of the cabin is actually squared off, versus the Cherokees kind of taper as they get up to the roof. So your headroom's great, shoulder room's good, they're wide. Legroom for the first and second row is excellent. So all around, the interior is really, really good on these planes as far as the room goes. Most of these planes still have the steam gauges, the standard 6-pack. Some are upgraded to glass. They're IFR certified if you want them to be, and go through everything that needed to fly IFR. So you can get your IFR in them. As far as flying, the Cessna 172s fly pretty decent. I don't like how they fly as much as the Cherokee that I fly. Maybe that's just me. They're a little harder to land. It's easy to get them a little too high and stall them out in the flare or things like that. It's just harder to grease that landing every time. Although these planes glide pretty well, that's one advantage they have over the Cherokees. The Cherokee with the Hershey bar wings don't really glide very well. The 172s glide excellent. So that's one thing going for the 172. Other than that, I mean, it's a good trainer. It flies well. There are no terrible tendencies. When it stalls, it's about an average stall. You definitely notice the stall, and it's definitely a stall as compared to the Cherokee 180 or other Cherokee models. They just kind of mushroom. But when the 172 stalls, it stalls. It doesn't really spin or doesn't try and get into a spin too easily, so you're not going to purposely spin that thing unless you try or you are very uncoordinated. Overall, it's a fairly decent flying plane. There's definitely reason it's one of the top trainers around. So the third plane on my list is actually one of the newest, and this is an all-composite plane. It's not made out of metal like the previous 2 planes I talked about, and that would be the Cirrus SR-20 and the SR-22 models. Now the SR-20, as I mentioned, is made out of composite materials. It's a low-wing fixed-gear plane. The SR-20 excuse me, is powered by the Lycoming IO360 engine, which is injected. And that one has around 200 horsepower. Now, the SR-22, I believe, has a turbo, which would be the TIO 550, I want to say, which I believe is Continental, but I'll have to make sure on that one. And I believe that has 310 horsepower. Although my main focus is going to be on the SR-20, because that's generally more of a trainer. An SR-22, you're mainly just going to buy and train in it if you want to get your pilot's license and fly that as a personal plane, because it's really excellent as a personal plane. It's roomy, very fast. So I'm mainly going to stick on the SR-22, but I just wanted to mention the SR-22 in there as well. So as I mentioned, the SR-20 has a 200 horsepower engine, and that will cruise, it'll probably push about 150 knots at 12 gallons an hour. So the fuel economy is not very good on the SR-20, and that will lend itself to a range of about 600 to 650 miles, depending on how you fly it. The useful load on these is pretty good. It's a true 4-passenger plane. The useful load is about 950 pounds. Although once you get 4 people in and fuel, you're at your gross, and you burn 12 gallons an hour, you're not going to be going that far. I mean, my guess would be 2 or 3 hours, depending on how heavy those people are and how much baggage you're carrying, obviously. So as far as cost of ownership of the SR-20, to purchase is about, on the lowest end, about $100,000 for an older model, and it's going to go all the way up to like $300,000 for the middle of the road used model. I think brand new ones are around $500,000, and they cost quite a bit to own, mainly because, which is one of the big selling points of this aircraft, is the airframe parachute that needs repacked. I believe it's every 6 or maybe every 9 years, and that costs quite a few $1,000s to do. And other than that, the engines are, especially in the SR-22, the engines cost quite a bit to maintain. They just cost a little more overall. They're not really an entry-level trainer. If you have the money and you want a decent performer that you're going to train in, that's more what they're for. Although flight schools do use the SR-20, but they're going to cost more hourly to rent those. So that's about it on the cost of ownership. As far as I know, I have not actually personally flown Cirrus like I have the Cherokees or the Cessna 172, so I can't tell you exactly how they fly, but from what I hear, they fly pretty decent. There's really no bad tendencies on those. They're a fairly decent trainer. That's about all I know. Where these things really shine is in the design of the plane. These things are slick, they're modern, they have doors that kind of open up upwards a little bit, kind of scissor doors, kind of hinting at maybe like a Lamborghini type of thing. They look really cool sitting on the ramp. They got some awesome paint schemes, or if you paint them, have someone paint them, they look awesome. So they really shine on the design, and the exteriors look great, as well as the interiors. The interiors are some of the roomiest 4-seat planes that you could imagine. They're perfect for getting 4 people in there in comfort, and they've got all the room they could ever want. The instrument panel in the Cirrus, the earliest models were a 6-pack with a couple of 430s in the center, and that mainly shifted. I think it was somewhere in like 2005 or 2006. They switched to an all-glass cockpit, which the brand new ones, SR-20 and SR-22, all are glass cockpit today. Although you can still find an older one with steam gauges if you prefer that. So that's about it on the SR-20. Moving on to my next plane, that would be the Cessna 150 / 152 models. They're kind of interchangeable. There's not much difference. So the Cessna 150 and 152, those are high-wing tricycle gear, fixed gear planes, and they're 2-seaters as opposed to everything else so far I mentioned was 4-seat planes. The early models had the Continental O200 engine with 100 horsepower, and then the later models had the Lycoming O235 engines, and I believe those were around 110 horsepower. The early model O200 engines had a TBO of about 1,800 hours. The new Lycoming engines, or the newer Lycoming engines, had a TBO of 2,400 hours, which is great for a flight training plane. so you can really push the overhaul on that. These planes will maybe do 100 knots at about 6 gallons an hour. They don't burn much fuel, which is good because they only hold 25 gallons of fuel. The range on these planes is going to be, depending on which one you buy and things like that, probably 300 to 450 miles. Obviously, the range is not great because you're going slow. You can only fly so far on 25 gallons of fuel. The useful load on these is about 500 pounds, give or take. Maybe you can get at 550, maybe they'll be lower depending on which plane you look at, like all the other planes I've mentioned on this list. So you could get yourself and an instructor in and fill the tanks, although I couldn't unless my instructor was very small because I weigh quite a bit, so that's really not a plane for a bigger guy. But where 150 does shine is on its cost. You can get a 150, I believe, for probably as low as 20,000, maybe 30,000, depending on which model you buy. And as far as cost of ownership, there really is not a cheaper plane to own and maintain, depending on which engine you buy and things like that. But they're very, very simple. They're about as cheap as you can get. Insurance should be cheap. Annual's going to be cheap as far as planes go. There's just not much cheaper than that. And these planes should fly fairly well. I do not have experience in a 150, so it's kind of the same story as an SR-20, although I've heard they're great trainers. Obviously, many people train in them. They're a little lighter, so crosswinds might be an issue. But as far as that, they do pretty well. The only trouble issue on these that I know of is the engines. The Continentals, the early Continentals, I believe had some issues with starters and things like that, I believe. And then after they put in the Lycoming, that was actually bigger problems for them. These fouled very badly as far as carbon in the cylinders and things like that. They had to keep doing top-end overhauls and clean the cylinders the best they could. And if they could keep that under control, the engines would go to 2,400 hours, but it was just carbon buildup very badly. So that's something you might want to look for if you're purchasing a plane. I'm not sure if they ever got that problem properly resolved or if it's just kind of things people are used to. Alright, so the last plane on my list is the Diamond DA-20. Now this is actually the smallest plane on my list. Weighs the least and has the least horsepower depending on which engine you buy. So the Diamond DA-20 is a low-wing fixed-gear plane like the rest. This is an all-composite plane as well, and it seats 2 people. Now what differentiates this from the rest of the planes on my list is it cannot be IFR certified. So that's something to consider. You're not going to get your IFR certification in a Diamond DA-20. Early models of the DA-20 had a Rotax engine. They had a Rotax 912 that produced 81 horsepower. Later models of the plane and today's models are sporting a Continental IO240 engine that has 125 horsepower. These planes will cruise at about 130 knots, and that's going to be pushing it a little bit at about 5 to 7 gallons an hour. That's depending on which engine you have, and so are the cruise speeds. So they're obviously pretty aerodynamically clean, and they fly fast for how much power they have, which is good. And if you look at pictures of this plane, they have a very long wing, almost like a glider, so they obviously glide very well. They're like I said, they're composite, they're very aerodynamically well designed. The useful loads on these planes are anywhere from 500 or 600 pounds, so it's going to be around the same as a Cessna 150, and you can get 2 people in and some fuel if you need to. Now 2 big guys are going to have trouble. They're probably going to be up close to gross with just 2 big guys in, if you both weigh 250 pounds. But anyway, the cost to purchase these are ranging anywhere from the cheapest, if I look right now, the cheapest are probably going for about $70,000. up to about, I don't know, 150,000, maybe 200,000. I don't know what the brand new ones cost. I did not look. But if you're planning on purchasing, you're most likely going to buy a used one, and that's about what they cost. Now, the cost to own these are fairly decent from what I hear. The engines are fairly reliable on these. They don't burn much fuel. Insurance should be cheap. They're fixed gear like everything else. So the cost of ownership is going to be pretty reasonable. As far as how these fly, these are very light planes. So anything is going to kind of disturb them. They're tricky to land in crosswind because they have a long wing and they glide well, but they're very light. So the wind kind of carries them around a little bit. Now that is as far as what I've heard personally and what I've researched. I've not flown a DA-20, so I can't give you concrete answers on that. As far as the design of these planes, like I said, they look more like a glider. They look fairly decent. I like the way they look on the outside. And on the inside, they're fairly well designed. They have a stick instead of a yoke. I believe it's between your legs. And they're not the roomiest plane inside. They're probably going to be like a 150. They're going to be tight for guys sized like me. Both the 150 and the DA-20 are, so maybe if you're a smaller guy, that'll be good for you. But you're going to be jammed. That's just the way it is. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video of the 5 planes that I would recommend for flight training, or kind of the top 5 planes historically for flight training in. Guys, if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button for me, drop a comment down below, tell me about it. Also hit that subscribe button for me, ring the bell next to that. You'll get notified every time I release a new video. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you guys like this new style of video, and I might be doing more of these in the future if you do. So be sure to let me know about that in the comments below. Alright guys, that's all I have for now, so signing off, Samuel the Aviator. Bye.